Good afternoon. What we wanted to do was put together a short description in a series of videotapes, the first of which is this one. So what we're going to do is go through a model of what we consider to be a successful exposure to content in the university classroom. And then subsequent to this, you'll watch a video from my colleague Harrison Kleiner in philosophy department. But what the purpose of this and the outcome of this next 20 minutes or so should be to set up a set of skills which you can use to be more successful in the classroom. So it keys up with some assignments. What we want to talk about today is how to interact with and build a relationship. It's kind of a funny way of saying it, but build a relationship with textbooks. So how to read and annotate textbooks with the intention of moving forward. How to take notes in class, which everybody can write, right? But there's a specific way that we'd like you to work on taking notes. And then just for a few minutes at the end, we'll talk about transitioning that material that you build in those two phases to a set of study guides. So the big question is, how do we get the most out of being here in the classroom? And what it is it's building a set of skills. It's like any other discipline that you engage in. You have to have a system, and you have to work the system. So every day when you go to class, you'll work that system. So the first thing that you want to do is think about reading textbooks and what you do with textbooks. And the answer is yes, you can write in textbooks. If you look at this book, this is a fairly old textbook from the 16th century. It was published in 1565, and then immediately, well, a few years after, it was on loan from a library in Paris to a student. And do you see what happened? The student wrote in the textbook, and it was with the intention of being able to process and remember the things. So I imagine there's some 16th century librarian, Mon Dieu, why have you written in my textbook, right? And they got a couple of, like a week's fine or whatever it is. But we've been doing this for a really long time. And we always get this question, well, is that going to devalue the textbook when I try to sell it back? And I think that's a bigger philosophical question about what's value. Are a few dollars getting paid by the bookstore in 12 weeks' time worth more than the value that you're getting out of learning the information that might be in your textbook? And I believe the answer is no. It's kind of a rhetorical question, right? So think about it as an investment in opportunity. The more you use your books, the more you engage and have relationships with them, the better off that you are. So the other question is, why do we annotate? And really, this is why we annotate, right? We want to annotate intentionally with the fact that we need to learn more and remember more. And we are in this kind of somewhat closed environment in higher education where you're in the classroom with the purpose of being assessed, right? Somewhere along the way, somebody's going to ask you to prove that you know the things that are in the books, that are in the notes. And so when you sit down to annotate, you want to annotate in a manner that's going to help you be better at taking tests, be better at writing papers, but also be a better human being, right? A hidden secret of universities we're in the building better human beings business. And so all of the knowledge that you take with you, which I'm sure you've all heard before, is something that's going to change your life forever. So that's good. We also annotate to stay active. I imagine I ask in classes, how many of you have fallen asleep while you're reading? And pretty much everybody says yes, right? Well, if you're doing something with your textbook that involves processing at a higher level in your mind, you have less of a chance to fall asleep. So we do read to stay active and be more engaged. So here's an example. We're going to have you read a copy of Plato's Allegory of the Cave from Republic. And this is the first page of the Benjamin Jowett translation. So what do we annotate? Well, that's a kind of a tricky question. What we annotate is what we think the instructor's going to ask us that we're going to have to prove later. But some examples might be things like key terms. Glaucon's an example. He's Socrates' interlocutor in the dialogue, so you might want to say that. You might ask important questions. What did Plato mean when he was using shadows as an example of something bigger in the allegory? Well, one interpretation of that you could answer, and you could say, well, the shadows signify the observation of the prisoners, and they're this mistaken belief maybe that what we see is not all that there is to know. You'll hear a real philosopher that does this for a living give you a better definition than that, I'm sure. We might want to draw pictures, right? That's a really bad picture because I am, in fact, a learning theorist, not an artist. So you might want to draw a picture. It is not a bunch of blurbs. It's an example of what I perceive the cave to look like in my mind. And so these are all just ways that we can help put in our mind methods that will allow us to remember things. So that's nice. The printers have been doing this since Gutenberg. They've been leaving us this nice little place on the side of the book to write in, and that's what we want to do. So when it comes time to study this stuff, what you can do is take a plain white sheet of paper, put over the text, go back, look at your annotations, and try to pretend that you're teaching someone, a roommate, your partner. I have 2 cats. I frequently do this with my cats. I'll explain to them what Plato meant when he was writing this. And if I can't explain it, then that shows a gap in my knowledge, and I have to go back and look at the information. And luckily, Plato, through Jowett, provided us this really cool resource to go back and look at it again. But major reason why we do this is because it's reduction of the content. What we can do is take something that somebody else wrote and reduce it down to about half of what it is. So when the time comes, you're worried about your exams, you go back and reread, you've essentially provided yourself in the margin a shortened version of the book so you can read it again. So that's always nice. So 50% less reading down the line is 50% more review that you'll have to do for exams. So we're also in the generating time business when we do this stuff. All right, so note-taking, that's the second phase. So you read before you go to class almost always, especially when you can. Then you go to class and take notes. Simple fact of the matter is our brains are not really good at remembering things when we hear things one time. And our professors likely might say things to us just one time that we need to remember. So it's always important for us to figure out another way to give our brains more exposure. And there's a built-in system that you can use. Here's a chart. This was based on some research that was done by a psychologist called Ebbinghaus. And what it basically shows is after about 9 hours of time on a single exposure to information, we'll lose about 70% of the capacity to recall it. So if we just hear things once, when you walk out of this door and you think about the presentations that you've heard today and in tomorrow even, somebody asks you, tell me what you learned. If you don't do anything besides listen, you're likely to learn, at that point, 70 to 80% of the stuff that you learned. So it's crucially important because we're going to have to reproduce it on assessments. We have to do something to keep that information in our minds. So here's a system. And it was invented by an educational psychologist called Walter Pauk in the 70s at Cornell University. And it's called and is known by Cornell, the Cornell note-taking method. And it's a fairly common thing to teach in high school. So a lot of you may already know how to use it. It's also called the inverted T, which is an exceptionally odd name given the fact that there's an inverted T on the paper there. So we have to record things. It's important to record what we hear. So you record things in that upper right hand. What's a tetrant? Is it a tetrant or it's not a quadrant? It's a tetrant. You record things in the upper right hand tetrant. That's not a word, I'm making it up. There, just the same way as you would. Write down what you think is crucially important. Write down what you hear in class. Write down what you think the instructor wants you to know. Then on the left-hand side, you reduce down that information, again, the same way that you reduced your textbook, into what you consider to be the crucial keywords and key points. So there you would write keywords. There you would write questions. There you would write cues. Cues are just things that will prompt you to remember the things that you learned. So for all of that stuff. Then sometime, and based on the Ebbinghaus curve, it probably ought to be within 9 hours after you hear the information. I'd say do it right after class. Write in your own words a summary of what you learned. And you don't need to do it on every page of the book, but you should do it for the major sections. And basically what this is again, if you have to tell your roommate, your partner, the cat, what you learned in class today, you should be able to go back and read that. Now, do you see how this works with, very similar to what we talked about with annotation? If you get in a bind and you completely run out of time and all you've got is 2 hours to cram for an exam, right? Walking to the coffee shop and your friend says, hey, did you study for your chemistry exam? And you say, what chemistry exam, right? Well, you can go back, just read your summaries, and you should, if you've done a good job of preparing them, you should do a pretty good job of being able to recall the information. So that's one way that you use notes. So then you take these notes that you've prepared, you recite them. You go and talk it through to yourself. Fold the paper over so you can't see your original notes. Use your cues and questions to prompt you to be able to recall the information. You reflect, you think about it. Why is this stuff important? And then you try to get into the dark recesses of your university professors' minds, right? Well, what is so important about this information that I'm going to have to recreate it on an exam? And then you review, and you do it before you go to sleep that night. That breaks the 9-hour point because you're renewing it. And then you need to do it at least twice a week. You need to pull up your old notes and look at them. Now, this also gives you a built-in on-task process so you can identify the stuff that you don't know. Because that's the stuff you'll have to find, go back, talk to the professor, talk to a recitation leader, talk to a supplemental instruction leader, talk to your buddies, your friends, look it up on the internet, do whatever you need to do to learn the information. Because at the end of the day, who has ownership on your education is you. And at the end of the day, when you get a degree from any institution, what it means is you've only worked as hard as you're willing to work, and you're only taking away with you the stuff that you've been responsible for. So at the end of the day, the more of this stuff that you do, the better the actual value of your degree is. So cheat sheets, right? Actually, study guides. You have to bring everything together. And you've got to do that in a way that's easy to study. You've got to do it in a way that's complete and precise. And complete and precise are something that bears talking about. When you're preparing study guides to study for exams, you need to make sure that you're not introducing errors. If you write down things that are not precise, and you think you've got 100% accuracy in your study guides, and you're studying the wrong thing, you cannot possibly do well on the exam. So it always pays to have somebody else in the class, and your instructor, talk about it. My favorite question in class is, do you have any questions, right? And then nobody says anything. Well, the questions are, hey, I was preparing my study guide last night, and this is my understanding of this thing. Is that accurate? So it's got to be precise, and then it's got to be complete. If you only write down 70% of the important information in the class, then the best possible score at 100% effectiveness you can get is 70%. So a little bit of a mistake at that point creates bad grades and potential failures. So you've got to make sure that it's complete. And it's got to be portable. Why should it be portable? Because when you're waiting outside, like today in the lecture hall, to come in here to listen, pull a set of 3x5 cards out of your pocket and take that 5 minutes and study and get consistent repetitions. We have found, and studies in my field have shown time and time again, that if you have an hour to study and you use all that hour in one chunk, your brain's going to remember a lot less than if you take 4 15-minute sections and get more repetition. So if you have something in your pocket that you can pull out while you're waiting for the bus, while the police officer's writing you a ticket, anywhere, make your life study and use your study to enhance your life. That also should be sufficient enough, and that's what we talked about with the 70%. You always should make sure that what you're studying is enough to do well under your expectations on the exam. All right, so here's how you can bring some study guides together. You can bring them together in a table. This is an example from the reading. On the top is what the specific examples from the allegory are, and then at the bottom there's some examples of what the writer meant by it. So that's one way to do it. 3x5 cards we talked about. I love a 3x5 card because there is not a single concept in the world that you can't at least start by writing it down on a 3x5 card. It's classic tabula rasa, right? It's that empty blank slate that you can do anything that you want with. You can make it your own. And so you can use 3x5 cards. And concept cards are a little bit bigger than the idea of flashcards. Flashcards were what we all did in Spanish class, right? Where on one side you've got mesa, on the other side you've got table, and you just go through them over and over again. Concept cards should, by nature of the content that you're studying, be bigger. And it should be big ideas. It should be lots of information. And then what you want to do is look at the idea on one side in a couple of words. On the other side, have a big concept and just talk them through. And we like to use a 3-to-1 ratio with this. Look at the concept, explain it as best you can, the same way you did with the summary on your annotations, or on your note-taking, excuse me. Talk it through. If you're convinced that you have a pretty good idea, put it in a pile that's the I got it pile. If you don't have a good idea, put it in the pile that's the I don't have it idea. And then go through the stuff you don't understand 3 times, and then on the 4th time, shuffle everything back together and go through the whole set again. Do this a dozen times, 50 times, 100 times. Do it as much as you need to do until the pile is full of all of the stuff that you know is every single card's on that side. And then at that point, you can convincingly say that you're satisfied that you know enough information to do well on the exam. Another thing, this is a Wordle. I don't know how many people are familiar with this. It's an online website. It's just a word cloud. What I did is I took every single word in the reading that we distributed and I put it into the cloud. The bigger the word, the more frequent the use of it was in the initial text base. And so you can take this and look at it. Socrates, pretty important idea, right? Glaucon, pretty important idea, maybe. He's a guy, but why is he there? What's the importance of it? But what you can do with this to study is go through, pick out important points. What do the shadows mean? What's the concept of light? And just talk it through and tell yourself stories. We are hardwired as human beings from the beginning of our cultural formation to sit around a fire, eat partially cooked meat, and talk about stuff that's important to us. So if you can find yourself talking about stuff that's important to you, that's a good way to get it into your mind. Track somebody down and explain this chart to them. Concept maps, another great way to do it. Start in the center with the main idea of the book and then run it out. This is the exact same information that was on that initial table, but it's just a different way of doing it. And how you study these is you start in the center and tell yourself a story. What's the significance of the sunlight? Who was involved with it? Why is it important to me in my life? How am I going to have to apply this knowledge? That's it. So take those study guides, bring them all together, overstudy to the point where you're convinced that you know more than you ever possibly knew before, and at that point you're ready for this. For 1,000 other things, 100,000 other things that you want to learn about study skills, we're always available on the 3rd floor of the Student Center.